we're in this series that we're calling Meet the Bible, and we've actually made it to the book of Deuteronomy. And one of the things I realize about the book of Deuteronomy is this. Every one of us, we come to junctures in our life where we kind of need to push the pause button and get some advice and get some counseling. And often these junctures, often these times are related to transitional periods. For example, adolescence. How many of you had a fun adolescence, right? It's a lot of struggles in adolescence. Can you imagine if somebody at, say, around the age of 11 had pulled us aside and said, you're getting ready to transition into an interesting time. Your body's going to change. Your emotions are going to change. Your relationships are going to change. How you see your parents are going to change. So over the next couple of years, I'm going to mentor you. And I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you know what to prepare for and what to expect during adolescence. I bet most of us would look back and say, I wish I'd had someone in my life like that. When you're getting ready to get married, that's another time. Maybe when you're getting ready to get divorced, that would be another time. After a tragic loss or after a tragic event in your life. Just to be honest with you guys, after I went through all that I went through, one of the most valuable things I did was went away to a private counseling place for several weeks. And I mean, you got up early in the morning and it started, and there were sessions all day long, and there were movies they made me watch at night, and I had to answer all these questions and all of these crazy things. But it was almost 24 hours a day, and it was incredibly helpful for me at that time. But what's true of all of those life experiences when we need some counseling and we need some advice is true of the book of Deuteronomy. It's a book of basically counseling. It's a book of advice given to a group of people who are getting ready to make an incredible transition into their life. It's written to the people of Israel. They're in a very, very critical time in their existence as a nation. For the past 38 years, they've been wandering around in the wilderness. And now they finally gotten to the place where they're getting ready to go into the land of Canaan. By the way, this is interesting. They haven't been there for 500 years. This is the land that God has set aside for them. But they hadn't been there, Israel, that what we now know as Israel, they hadn't been there for 500 years. They haven't been there since Jacob had his 12 sons, and that family grew into a family of 70. And then when the famine came, they relocated to Egypt. And when that happened, the land was vacant. So what happened was the people moved in. They became known as the Canaanites. And as a result, the land of the Canaanites, there were all kinds of immoral, unbelieving, corrupt, degenerate people now living in the land of Canaan. If you can't wrap your head around what that might look like, just think Chapel Hill. Okay, it's that kind of environment, okay? And the people of Israel, they're getting ready to go into that kind of environment. So God, before they go in through Moses, he pulls the people aside and he says, listen, you're my people. You're my people. You're my chosen people. And when you go into the land, I expect you to be different. Even though you're going to be surrounded by a whole new lifestyle, even though you're going to encounter all kinds of idols and all kinds of shrines to gods you know nothing about, God says, listen, you're not to have anything to do with them. You're to stay true to me. You're not to change. And so God, he kind of pulls them aside and he gives them this advice, this last minute advice before they make the transition. So really that is the book of Deuteronomy. Let me just start by giving you an introduction to the book, kind of an overview. First of all, the name. We know that the name Deuteronomy, we already know it's a Greek name. And we know because in 250 BC, a group of 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. It's known as the Septuagint. Septuagint actually has the number 70 in it. And so when they translated it into Greek, because it was the language of the day, they gave each one of these books a name. The original Hebrew name for Deuteronomy is words. That's it, words. And it had to do with the words of Moses. But they named it Deuteronomy. Why did they name it Deuteronomy? Well, it comes from two Greek words. First, deuteros, which means second, nomos, which means law. So you put them together and you have the second law. In fact, this is the second place in the Bible where the Ten Commandments appear. They appear first in Exodus, and then they appear here. But this is not just a meaningless repetition of the same old law. The word Deuteronomy or deuteros carries with it the idea of a summary. It's a reminder of the original law. And it's because, again, they're getting ready to go into this land, and they're going to face a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities to make the choice to ignore what God has said up to this point, not to be obedient to God. Let me just give you an example. And maybe you never thought about it, but when they move into the land of Canaan, they're going to run out all the inhabitants of the land. And when they run them out, it's going to be like they won the lottery. Because all of a sudden, these are people for 430 years who were slaves, and then they've wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years. These people have never owned anything. To quote my dad, they didn't have a pot to pee in or a window to throw it out of. These were poor people. They're going to move into houses as they run these people out of Canaan. They're going to move into houses they didn't have to build. They're going to eat the fruit and the vegetables from crops and vineyards they didn't have to plant. They're going to eat protein from livestock that they didn't have to raise. And there's going to be a great temptation because who took care of them all the way through the wilderness? God. He gave them manna. We saw last week he gave them quail up to their tail. I think some of you quoted that, right? But God took care of them. And all of a sudden, they're going to see possibly themselves as self-sufficient and get to the point where they're tempted not to trust God. That's the new temptation they're going to face. That's going to be a challenge. In fact, they're going to face all kinds of new temptations. They're going to face people living all kinds of new lifestyles, all different kinds of behaviors they have never witnessed in their lives. They're getting ready to experience that. So they need to be reminded one more time before they go in what God expects of them. What's the location? Well, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "These are the words of Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan." And then it says in verse 5, "East of the Jordan in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound the law, saying." So think about this. They're in the land of Moab. They're just on the other side of the Jordan River. They're getting ready to cross over into the Jordan River. They're getting ready to invade the land. They're getting ready to conquer the land of Canaan. By the way, let me just also mention, this location is very, very significant. Do you know why it's significant? Because they've been right here before. This is where they were 38 years earlier. This is where they were when they made it to Kadesh Barnea in the book of Numbers. They got right there, and what did they do? They sent in the 12 spies, not to say whether or not they could go in. God's already said, "I'm going to give you the land." They sent in the spies. 12 of them came back. 2 of them said, "We can do this," Caleb and Joshua. 10 said, "We can't do it," and they failed to trust God. They had been right at this place before, so it's significant. Now, what's the purpose of the book? Very simple. It's to encourage Israel's loyalty to God. That's the purpose of the book. In fact, let me give you the key section of the entire book. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning in verse 4. It says this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them on your foreheads." By the way, if you've ever been to Israel, you've seen that. You've seen the phylacteries. They wrap them around their wrists. They put them on their forehead. It's verses from the law. "Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses." How many of you have been to Israel? Okay, when you go into every hotel in Israel, there's a little thing that looks like a little scroll. It's about this long, and it's about as big as a pencil. And when you walk into every door in Israel, the law is there. It's inside that little container. "Write them on the door frames of your homes and on your gates." And basically what it's saying, the law of God is to mark your life. It's to mark your home. It's to mark your children. It's to mark your family. It's to mark every aspect of your life. In other words, you're to take God seriously. Now, why does Moses emphasize this so much? You've got to take God seriously. It's because, see, he knew they were getting ready to go into a land where that wasn't going to be the case. They didn't even know Jehovah God. So they certainly weren't going to take God's laws seriously. By the way, some of you may have experienced a similar situation like this when you went away to college. Maybe you grew up in a very conservative, kind of a strict Christian home, and you went off to college, and all of a sudden, you were surrounded by a lifestyle that was totally foreign to the way that you were raised. And that experience kind of just smacked you right in the face, right? You were introduced to all kinds of new behaviors and new vocabularies, new values, new opportunities, new ideas. Well, that's kind of the similar situation that the Hebrew people find themselves in. So through the book of Deuteronomy, it's Moses' task to prepare the people for what they're about to face. Now, there are 3 things in this book that the people are reminded to remember. when it comes to God. Let me just give them to you. First of all, it's remember the faithfulness of God. If you wanted to break the book down, chapters 1 through 4 talk about you got to remember the faithfulness of God. By the way, it's really interesting. It's important that we see this moment as Israel saw this moment. As they're standing at Kadesh Barnea looking over the Jordan River, getting ready to go into the land, understand for them, this is a bad memory. This is a bad memory. This is exactly where they had stood 38 years earlier. They had heard God say, this is the land, I'm going to give it to you. All you have to do is go and take it. But you know the story. They didn't trust God. The result was disastrous. Everybody over the age of 19 died in the wilderness. No one over the age of 57, because they wandered for 38 years, entered into the promised land. So this is a bad memory for them. Let me just say something here about memory. There are times in our life, have you noticed, where God will bring back a bad memory? Memory is an interesting thing. Memory can be an enjoyable thing. A couple of Friday nights ago, Shannon and I went to dinner with my sisters and their husbands, and we sat in Enrico's for a few hours, and we laughed, and we thought about childhood and different things that we experienced and conversations we had, and it was just so joyful. So sometimes memory is an enjoyable thing. But let's be honest, sometimes memory is a disastrous thing. Because my guess is every one of us sitting in this room in this morning, every one of us, we have something in our lives we just wish we could forget. We just wish we could forget it. But here's what's interesting. God will not let us forget it. Why is that? If God removes it as far as the east is from the west and he forgives us and he doesn't remember it anymore, why won't God let us forget it? Well, I think he wants us to remember what the days were like when we didn't do life his way and we ended up in the wilderness, if for no other reason to make sure that we have the motivation not to go back there again. I've got some times in my life I wish I could forget. And I'm guessing you probably do too. And that's why how we find the children of Israel. And that's what Moses is doing with these people. He's saying, hey, don't forget. This is where we were 38 years ago. And God stayed faithful. The whole time we were wandering in the wilderness, God stayed faithful. By the way, one of the verses says that their shoes didn't wear out for 38 years, that God was still taking care. So what he's saying is God stayed faithful even when we were unfaithful. And so for the next few chapters, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, Moses, he retraces their steps and he says, remember the faithfulness of God in spite of your unfaithfulness. By the way, I think all of us, when we can look back over our lives, and as you get older, you're going to find yourself doing that. You're going to find yourself reviewing your life when you hit certain birthdays, certain milestones. There's not a time I don't do a funeral service where I don't sit on that stage and while other people are talking, I'm looking into the faces in the crowd thinking, I wonder how I'm going to be remembered. I wonder what people are going to say about me, right? Because every one of us, we have times in our lives where we had times of failures and times of where we turned our back on God and we were unfaithful to God. But here's what I want you to understand this morning. Even during those times when we are unfaithful to God, God never left us. Now think about that. I don't care when you were at your worst. See, when you're at your worst, God's at his best. And no matter how unfaithful you are, God is never going to abandon you. Now, let me clarify something. He will discipline you. Sometimes he will shake you to your core. He may scar us in such a way that we never forget. But regardless of what we do and regardless of how we turn our back on him, he never, ever leaves us. I think one of the great motivators for living obediently is the reminder of times in our life when we didn't and the consequences that resulted. So when you talk about the first 4 chapters, you're talking about the faithfulness of God, even though Israel wasn't faithful. When you get to chapter 5, the theme changes, and it's the second remember the holiness of God. That's the next section. So when you get to chapters 5 through 26, the emphasis on God's faithfulness isn't on God's faithfulness, but it's on God's holiness and it's on God's purity. And Moses basically says, okay, you're back where you were 38 years ago. You're getting ready to go into the land. Yes, don't forget that God's faithful, but also don't forget that God is holy. Now, if you've read through the book of Deuteronomy, through these chapters, one of the weird chapters, groups of chapters is like chapter 22, chapter 23, chapter 24. It's known as the miscellaneous laws. Honestly, I can't even talk in a mixed room about some of the stuff that's in the miscellaneous laws. And I think often we read things like this and we laugh and we wonder why God was, it's just weird, and we just get bogged down in the details. So I jotted down a couple of things. When you think about God's laws, as ridiculous as they seem, think about it this way. First of all, God's law brings freedom. He gave these laws. It could be freedom from disease. It could be freedom from injury. It could be freedom from bureaucracy. But when God gave what seems like really weird, peculiar laws, he gave them for a reason, and one of them was freedom. The second one is order. And order always promotes life. Order always promotes goodness. It promotes harmony. And so God gave these laws, which we read. They seem ridiculous to us, but they bring order. But the third one is relationship. Because those who choose to obey the laws, they're free from fear. They're free from injustice. They're going to be free from opposition. They're going to be free in their relationship with God because they're following the law. But here's the other thing. They're going to be free in their relationships with fellow men. So again, God wants to keep these people. Remember, they're called a very peculiar people. They're his chosen people. He wants them to be distinct. He wants them to stand out in the land. So he gives them even these miscellaneous laws, and he wants them to obey them. So this is what Moses says, getting into this section in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our ancestors that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, with all of us who are alive here today." So he's talking about those who survived the wilderness experience. "The Lord spoke to you face to face out of the fire on the mountain. At that time I stood between the Lord and you to declare to you the word of the Lord, because you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain." And he said, what did he say? Well, when you get to verses 6 through 21 of chapter 5, Moses reviews the commandments that God gave them. It's the second law. In this you will find the 10 commandments. He repeats the 10 commandments. And Moses says, now that we're back where we started 38 years ago, let's make sure we remember what God said. Let me just summarize these chapters. We don't have time to go through all of them by giving you 3 statements. Here's the first one. Blessings accompany obedience. Moses wants the people to know that. Blessings accompany obedience. When you obey God, blessings follow. I've always described it as it's like a circle, and within the circles are the laws, the precepts, the principles, the truths of God. And when we live inside this circle, I call it the circle of blessability. You have positioned yourself to be blessed. Now, when you get outside the circle, which we've all done, this is what's interesting. There may be times where you still feel that God is blessing you. But when you live within it, and God, that's just grace out there. But when we live within it, you're positioning yourself to be blessed by God. So blessings accompany obedience. Second, compromises weaken distinctives. In other words, when God gives you a standard and you're faced with the temptation to compromise, if you compromise, your distinctives, let me use another word, your reputation as God's child, is going to be weakened. And I speak from experience. There are thousands of people that would never, ever again in their life walk across the street to hear what I have to say. Because of what I did weakened my distinctives, my reputation. It's one of the consequences. You know what one of my biggest, I don't know what I call it, probably what haunts me more than anything, or maybe some lost people, by observing me, said, if that's what it's really like, I'm not interested. But you got to understand, God is gracious. God is gracious, but you got to understand, compromises, they're going to weaken our distinctives. Our reputation is going to take a hit. And then here's the third one. Consequences follow disobedience. And I thought I would just stop here and let everybody share a story from their life of how they really screwed up and the consequences. Okay, so Joe, we're going to start with you if you would just stand up. No, I'm just kidding. I don't think I need to belabor this point. We know we know that consequences follow disobedience. Let me show you an illustration of these three things. You can see them right out of chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 13 says this: if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine, and olive oil. I will provide grass in the field for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. In other words, you're going to be blessed. Then you see verse 16. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Well, there's a compromise. And so he tells them to watch out, because when they consider it, they're going to fall. He says you're going to lose your distinctives. And then the consequences are in verse 17. Then, as a result of that, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. Probably another good place to stop and apply this a little bit. We live right now in a world system that can be summed up 4 words: fortune, fame, power, pleasure. That pretty much sums up the culture we live in. Fortune, fame, power, and pleasure. Fortune, get rich quick. Keep, hoard, be selfish. Fame, make a name for yourself at any cost. Whatever it costs, make a name for yourself. Third, power. Figure out how to leverage it. Get control over people. And then pleasure at any cost. And what's interesting about this world system of fortune, fame, power, and pleasure, it's set up in such a way, it works in such a way, often we can conform to it, and we don't even realize we're conforming to it. It's so subtle. And often we'll look at our lives back over the past 5 years and say, what happened? How did I used to be here in my walk with God, and now I'm here. And none of these things are necessarily bad in themselves. But then when they get out of control in our life, it can consume us and we don't even realize it. So God says, listen, you may have to live in that system, but don't forget me. I wonder how many Christians, and I wonder this more and more as I watch society, how many of us can honestly say that the principles we literally live our life by, our core values, are based on biblical principles? Or if we're honest, how many of us would say there's been a shift in our life and we didn't even realize it was taking place? So God wanted to make sure with the people of Israel, they were aware that this can happen without you even knowing it. You are going into this lifestyle. You're going into this culture. You got to be on the lookout for it. Now, before the book closes, Moses says, listen to God's warning in the future. And what I want to do is I want to summarize these last few chapters by pointing out 2 sections. When you get to chapter 8, God reminds Moses of 2 things. First of all, he says, the land is yours, possess it. The land is yours, possess it. It's not a matter of whether or not you can have it. It's yours. You're going to have to go get it. And then second, the Lord is God, obey him. Let me show it to you. Chapter 28, verse 1, it says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, the crops of your land and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds, the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. And now notice verse 6. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. That's a Hebrew colloquialism saying you're going to live a life of prosperity. You're going to experience prosperity. So God says this, I promise my blessing on your life. I even promise you prosperity if you walk with me. Now, we talked back in Joseph, prosperity can come in all kinds of form. But God says, that's what you're going to experience if you walk with me. Basically, life's going to be good. But now you get to verse 15 of chapter 28. However, so now we have a shift. If you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed. The crops of your land, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. You will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. In other words, that's just another way of saying God's discipline is going to be all over your life. Again, not punishment, discipline. Because what does he want to do? He wants to bring you back into the life that he wants you to be in. But he says, if you choose to obey me, there are going to be consequences. By the way, let me just say this also. The misery that God can bring into your life defies description. And if any of you have been prodigal long enough, you know. But the misery God can bring into your life to discipline you and to bring you back defies description. I think that's why Proverbs 13 verse 5 says, God's judgment wins favor, but the way of the unfaithful leads to destruction. I like the King James Version. Good understanding giveth favor, but the way of the transgressor is hard. Does that not describe the prodigal son sitting in a pig trough, eating the leftover of the pigs, wondering what in the world happened? The way of the transgressor is hard. The book of Deuteronomy can really be summed up with God's advice to us when you get to chapter 30, verse 15. He says this, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. This is just the best advice. Listen to this. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. Basically what God is saying, you get to make the choice. But I think it's interesting. That's the kind of way it is in every one of our lives. And it's this. If you make wise choices, good things happen. If you make dumb choices, bad things happen. But this is what's interesting. He says, if you do this, he says, you'll live long in the land. But if you don't, and I told you just a couple of weeks ago, after David's reign, and after Saul's reign, and David's reign, and Solomon's reign, after a united kingdom of 120 years, there was a civil war. Two of the tribes stayed in the south and became known as Judah. 10 of the tribes went to the north and became Israel. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by Assyrians and are destroyed, and you never hear of them again. The southern kingdom in 586 BC falls to the Babylonians, spends 70 years in captivity before God restores them. And so he's true to his word. But here's what's interesting. It's your choice. It's your choice. And that's the way it always is, if we're honest. That's what it always comes down to. This is such one of those lessons that you got to get some application, okay? And I think for all of us, this kind of rings true, or maybe we have a child right now who's dancing on the edge. We're a little concerned about, so let me just give you a little bit of application this weekend. Let me just ask you a couple of questions, because it comes down to making wise choices and decisions. So here's the first question. Can you name a person outside your family from whom you receive wise counsel? In other words, as you come to these junctures of life that we've talked about, is there somebody outside your family? Because I don't even think family often can be, objective. So is there somebody outside your family who has nothing to gain, nothing to lose, no dog in the fight, that you're getting advice from? If you can, good for you. If you don't, I would just say this. I would just say, begin to pray today. I would make this a top priority. God, bring somebody in my life like that. Whether it's a neighbor, a coworker, a friend, but bring somebody in my life that I feel like I can be open and honest with. By the way, here's some qualifications for the kind of person that you should be looking for. And these qualifications, I would say, come straight from the Bible. First of all, make sure they're a Christian. Make sure they adhere to the value of God's word. What did Solomon say in Ecclesiastes? How can two walk together unless they're agreed? You got to agree what the rules are, the ground rules, and the ground rules are the absolutes of God's word. You know what's been interesting to me is after I went through what I went through, how many people have met with me thinking that I changed my mind on divorce and those kinds of things. No. I had 2 situations this week, and this is what I told them. If you can do anything, make it work. Make it work. You got to find somebody who's not willing to change the rules just because to fit your situation, who will speak the truth in love. So that's the first thing. Can you name a person outside your family from whom you receive wise counsel? Second, they should be an encourager. You ever had somebody that in your life that every time they came to you, they were going to speak the truth, but not necessarily in love? My first church I pastored, I had a board member, and I knew if he wanted to have lunch with me, I was in trouble. And I remember one time he took me to lunch, and in those days, it's the first church I pastored, and I was very, very poor in Southern California. But there was a guy that ran a men's clothing store, and every once in a while, he would call me and say, "Hey, come on in tomorrow. I got a suit I want you to try on." And I'd go in, I'd try these suits on. Oh, man, it's yours. And I remember one time he gave me the suit, and that's back in the days when pastors preached in suits, right? And so I tried this suit on, and he said, "Man, you know what would look great with this suit?" And he had a pair of some kind of snakeskin shoe, loafers or something. He kicked them right off. "Slide those on." I slid them in. He said, "They're yours. They look great with that suit." Well, the next week, I preached in that suit, in those shoes. On Wednesday, I got a phone call from one of my elders. "We need to have lunch." And he said, "Those shoes you wore Sunday really bothered me. That was very ostentatious." I'm like, I couldn't buy a pair of shoes like that if I wore it my whole life, right? I just was happy to have them. But see, you don't want somebody like that every time the doorbell rings or you get a text, "Oh no, what did I do wrong now?" Okay, so find someone who is able to encourage you, okay? And here's the third one. They have to be able to keep a secret. You want to be able to share something confidentially that you're not going to hear from somebody else in about 4 or 5 days. I really believe that when James says, "Confess your sins to one another and you will be healed," he's not talking about standing up in front of a congregation or a Bible study. He's saying find somebody in your life. And you know why most of us don't do it? Because we've done it before, and then a few days later, we found out that everybody knew about it. By the way, let me tell you something else. If you're always saying, "You need to confess your sins, you need to confess, you need to be on," you know what? As Christians, then we have to be able to handle it. And that's the other reasons people don't. Because if I tell you, you're probably going to be gone. You're probably not going to have anything to do in my life anymore. So make sure they're Christians, make sure they're an encourager, and make sure they're able to keep a secret. But those are 3 qualities of someone that you should be praying that God brings into your life. You get wise advice and wise counsel on so that you're making good decisions. Here's the second question. And maybe this is a more basic question. Are you aware of the dangers of making decisions solo? I mean, the reality is we all have blind spots, don't we? There's one exit. If you pull out of our neighborhood, because of the way the road curves, I can't really tell. And every time we get there, I say, "Shannon, is it clear?" And she says, "It's clear, you can go." What am I saying? I got a blind spot. I can't see. Every one of us, let's be honest, every one of us have blind spots. And so are you aware of the dangers of not knowing what those blind spots are, but not only that, of hearing the wrong kind of advice from the wrong people? Again, I talked to 2 individuals this week. They're going through situations in their marriage. And you know what I discovered with both of them? They're listening to people who are giving totally the wrong advice. You know who will give you the wrong advice? The people that have gone through the same thing you've gone through, and they got burned, and they're bitter. You want to get some good advice? Go to a bitter old girl that's been burned in a divorce or a relationship. Right? What are you going to get? You're going to get bitter old advice, right? So you got to find someone who can see your blind spot and yet still speak the truth in love. It's called accountability. And accountability, it forces us to go deeper with maybe just a couple of people, but to get beneath the surface, someone who can see our blind spots and in love say, "Hey, Mike, you may not even realize this, but you've mentioned this a couple of times, or you've done this a couple of times, and I'm not even aware you are aware of the consequences." of making those kinds of decisions. So we got to find those individuals. And as we do that, I think that we will become the kind of decision makers that God wants us to become. And as we just saw through the book of Deuteronomy, our lives, our future, hanging in the balance. Let me just tell you something. Christianity is not an individual sport. If you're going to make it, I hate to quote her, but it will take a village. It'll take a village. Not a big village. Why are you guys laughing? I was quoting Mrs. Dr. Seuss. I don't know who you guys think I was quoting. What you're going to need that team around you that you feel comfortable with and who feel comfortable with speaking the truth in love. Well, man, next week we got a great book because we're in Joshua. And it's a book of encouragement and it's a book of victory. So don't be too beat up by Deuteronomy this week because just like the nation of Israel, we've all been there. But the book, we're going to find out how we can get victory in so many areas of our life this week and how God is fighting for us, that he's fighting for us constantly. In fact, he's going ahead in many of our battles and taking care of the fortress and the cities and the giants because he knows we're coming in behind him. So we're going to see that in the book of Joshua next week. Father, thank you for our time together. And I pray for each one of us because this could be one of those lessons that you feel so beat down. But maybe we just learn. That's all we can do is learn. We can say, I've been there, I've done it, and I learned. And Father, then we're actually prepared not just to speak in theory to people who are also thinking about going the same route to be able to say, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Father, thank you for being such a gracious God. Thank you that your mercies are consumed every morning. And even when we stray from you, you never abandon us. You never turn your back on us. And we thank you for that. Give us a great day in your name. Amen.